Today, I'm speaking with Alan Hájek. Alan is a professor of philosophy at the Australian National University. Years ago, he did his PhD at Princeton, where he won a fellowship for displaying, in the judgment of the university, the highest scholarly excellence of all graduate students across all of their disciplines. These days, he has broad-ranging interests across epistemology, philosophy of language, and philosophical methodology. His work is of great interest to me and the effective altruism community because he is one of the world's top experts on the philosophy of probability, Bayesianism, decision theory, expected value, and counterfactuals. Some of his more memorably titled papers include 15 Arguments Against Frequentism, Waging War on Pascal's Wager, Vexing Expectations, Most Counterfactuals Are False, and a follow-up paper titled Most Counterfactuals Are Still False. He's currently working on a book on counterfactuals titled Woodwork. This is our first ever live recording of the show, so for once I should also welcome all of you in the audience as well. And before we quieten down for the recording, let's have a round of applause for Alan.
Thank you. Great to be here, Rob. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Okay, I hope we're going to get to talk about whether Bayesianism is the final big evolution in probability and why you think objective consequentialism is even wronger than many people can even imagine. But first, you started out studying maths and statistics, which are kind of practical fields in which you could have been gainfully employed doing something of obvious value.
Yes.
What made you switch into philosophy after you finished your undergrad degree?
Yeah, I was studying, as you say, maths and statistics, and I went to lots of courses on probability, and my professors would write equations on the board, P of this equals P of that. And I was wondering, what is this P? What does probability mean? And I asked one of them, what does probability mean? And he looked at me like I needed medication. And he said, well, that's a philosophical question. And I began a master's in statistics. And I got as far as photocopying the article that my supervisor wanted me to read. And I sat down, started reading it, and I went, ugh. And I don't know if you've seen Pulp Fiction, but there's a moment where Jules, the hitman, has a moment of clarity.
Right.
And I had a moment of clarity. I realized I didn't want to go on with statistics, but what to do instead. Traveled the world hoping to find myself on the road, and I did. It happened in Western Ontario, and a friend of mine who'd had his moment of clarity was studying philosophy there. He showed me the courses that he was studying, he was looking at, and I thought, wow, how cool is that? And you could hear the penny drop several provinces away. That was my second moment of clarity. Yeah. That's what I want to do, philosophy.
What was it that bugged you? I mean, like, obviously most statisticians kind of don't care about these deeper questions about what probability is, given that they can just like do operations on it. Why couldn't you let it go?
Yeah. In a way, I was less interested in the sort of practical payoffs. I was just wondering, where does probability fit into my sort of my conceptual scheme? You know, how does it relate to other things? What does it really mean? When I say something like the probability of rain tomorrow is 0.3, what have I said? I understand the stuff about rain, but the probability stuff I didn't understand. And here I am, I'm still asking that question. What does P mean?
Yeah, okay, well, we'll get to what P means later on. But like, what are your main focuses at the moment? I guess, so you're working on counterfactuals primarily, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the book Woodwork, thanks for the advertising. And as always, I'm working on probability. I still ask, what is P? And that's related to decision theory, something that I think quite a lot about. That got me into things like Pascal's wager. I'm still thinking about that. We'll probably talk about my heuristics, and some of that comes up as well. Yeah,
makes sense. Okay, so to briefly map things out, Alan and I are going to do an hour-long session up here on stage. Then we're going to go backstage and do another couple of hours out there. I think, and I'm sure you all love the show, but having you sit here quietly for 3 hours might try even your patience. But you will get to hear the full conversation on the 80,000 Hours feed once we get it all edited up and published, which actually might take a minute because my producer Kieran is away on summer holidays. It might be until September, but I think these issues are sufficiently timeless that still come September we will not have solved all of these puzzles. So we're going to get into the details of probability and counterfactuals later on. But first, I wanted to dive into this other passion of yours, which is philosophical methodology. Yeah, how did you first get into that topic?
Yeah, it began when I was a graduate student at Princeton. I was surrounded by these really good philosophers. I wanted one day to be a good philosopher, or as good as I could be. And I noticed there were these recurring patterns of thought, sometimes in their work, sometimes in conversations, sometimes in Q&A. For example, I would hear a really good question at Q&A. 3 weeks later, the same person would ask a similar question. I thought, it worked last time, it worked again. There's a recurring pattern here.
Yeah.
I'll internalize this. So I started to make a list of these recurring patterns of thought, philosophical techniques that seem to be fertile. And now my list is hundreds long.
Why isn't this just already an obvious thing? You would think you would kind of start a philosophy PhD just, or like, here's all of the tools in the toolkit, just like go and do this. Yeah.
It's funny, I think that these are strangely underexplored. We teach our students logic, for example. That's certainly one tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
But I think we have all these other techniques and we don't nearly discuss them enough, think about them. And then I went on to teaching at Caltech, and I had these very smart students for 10 weeks. How do I convey to them how philosophy is done? Of course, I had them read the classics, Descartes and Hume and so on. But along the way, I would occasionally drop in these philosophical heuristics, these techniques, partly just to show them how philosophy is done, but also just it helps you do philosophy. And philosophy is hard.
Yeah.
I think we could use all the help that we can get, especially when you've just written some philosophical paper, some view of your own. It's curiously hard to be your own critic, and other people are lining up to point out the problems with your view. But these heuristics, I think, help guide your mind to finding the problems before others gleefully
do it for you.
Point them out. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, one of your papers on this topic, well, you sound extremely defensive in a sense that you're like worried that other philosophers are going to judge you for daring to write down a bunch of heuristics. Yeah, do you want to explain what's going on with that?
Yes, it's as if I'm like the magician who gives away the tricks of the trade. And I find this a very strange attitude. I mean, think of some other area where there are heuristics, like chess. There's no problem with a chess book actually giving you some advice to castle early and often avoid isolated pawns. Or in maths, there are various fertile heuristics. But I don't know, somehow in philosophy, some people view it with a bit of suspicion that this isn't really depth, this isn't really getting to the profundity of philosophy. And I'm not saying you should just follow these heuristics mindlessly. Just like when you're playing chess, you shouldn't just mindlessly
follow
play
the rules.
Things. Yeah, but I think they help. I think they get you closer to your targets, and I think that they actually help creativity too. That somehow, as I said, philosophy is hard. So these are just techniques to breaking down a hard problem into easier sub-problems, and then you can make progress on those.
Okay, so yeah, let's hear one of these heuristics. What's one that really stands out as especially useful?
Yeah, I like the one I call check extreme cases. Okay, you're in some domain. Extreme cases are things like the first case, or the last case, or the biggest, or the smallest, or the best, or the worst, or the smelliest, or what have you.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you've got this huge search space. Someone gives a big philosophical thesis. Suppose you want to test it, stress test it. Are there counterexamples? Hard problem. Somewhere in this search space, find trouble, find counterexamples. Easier subproblem. Go to the corner cases, go to the extreme cases, and often the trouble lurks there, if it lurks anywhere, and it's a smaller search space.
Yeah.
So that's the technique. I could give you some examples if you like.
Give us an example or two.
All right. Grandiose philosophical thesis. Every event has a cause.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And at first you might think, gee, I don't know, is that true or false? It's kind of hard to tell. All right. Hard problem. Come up with a counterexample to every event has a cause. Easier subproblem. Consider extreme cases of events. For example, the first event. Call it the Big Bang.
Yeah.
The Big Bang didn't have a cause. Counterexample. Or philosophers sometimes say that you should only believe in entities that have causal efficacy. They have some oomph.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's maybe a reason to be suspicious of numbers. Maybe numbers don't exist because they don't cause anything. And then Lewis has us imagine, well, what about the entity which is the whole of history? There's causation
Everything
within
altogether.
it, but that doesn't cause anything.
Right.
So according to this principle, you shouldn't believe in the whole of history. Okay, so they're the heuristics doing, I suppose, negative work. It's destructive, shooting down some position. But I think it could also be constructive. All right?
Yeah, maybe it's worth explaining a little bit of, I guess, one of your theories of what philosophy is.
Yeah.
You want to...
Oh, well, I think you're thinking of a lot of philosophies, the demolition of common sense followed by damage control.
Yeah, I love that quote, yeah.
And philosophy often comes up with some radical claim like, we don't know anything. But then we try to soften the blow a bit and we find some way.
Maybe we know a little bit.
We know a little bit, or we have to understand knowledge the right way. Anyway, so far the heuristics have been, this extreme cases heuristic was somewhat negative. It was pointing out a counterexample to some big thesis. I think it could also be constructive. I guess maybe long-termism could be thought of in this way. Maybe the thing that comes naturally to us is to focus on the short-term consequences of what we do, and we think that's what matters.
Yeah.
Then you push that out a bit. And then an extreme case would be, well, gosh, our consequences, our actions have consequences until the end of time, for the rest of history. So maybe we should be more focused on that.
Yeah.
And that's now the beginning of a more positive, movement.
Yeah. I guess so the philosophical question there might be like, well, how long should we consider the consequences? Or like, what should be the scope of our moral consideration? And here say, well, let's consider the extreme possibility that we should consider all space and all time forever.
That's right. Yeah. And then a related heuristic, so I started with check extreme cases, then sometimes you might just check near extreme cases. So you back off a bit and they're a little bit more plausible. So maybe we don't need to look until the end of time, but still look far ahead. And that is still at some odds with initial common sense.
Yeah, I guess people might often come back and say, well, sure, in the extreme situation it doesn't work, but like lots of things don't work in the extremes. Like it's more sensible to focus on the middle cases.
Yeah.
And so this isn't like actually such a powerful objection. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's for that very reason that this is a fertile heuristic, because we spend our lives mostly living among the normal cases. So extreme cases don't come so naturally to us, even though they may well be trouble for some philosophical position. In fact, maybe especially because they're extreme, they're more trouble than the middle cases.
Yeah, I guess it depends on whether the claim is like a more pragmatic one about like how you ought to do things every day, or whether you're trying to claim that I've discovered some like transcendent fundamental truth, and you'll be like, well, it doesn't work in this like one case. That's it. You said it. You were claiming that this was like something that should cover everything, and now it doesn't.
And philosophers often do that. They have these grandiose claims. Every event has a cause, or what have you. Yeah. And this is a good way of stress testing such claims.
Okay. Yeah. What's another heuristic?
Yeah. I like to focus on the word the. And I say, see the word the in neon lights, because it typically comes with a presupposition. The X typically presupposes there's exactly one X. There are two ways that could go wrong. There could be multiple X's, or there could be none at all. Right?
Yeah.
So an example of that. Do the right thing. just rolls off.
Sounds straightforward enough.
Rolls off the tongue. All right, the right thing. Now that sounds like there's exactly one right thing to do. Well, two ways we could challenge that. There could be multiple right things.
Yeah.
And maybe it's okay if you do any one of them, but still, that we're challenging the presupposition there's exactly one. This comes up, by the way, I don't know if we'll get to talk about Pascal's wager at some point, but it turns out that there are many ways to follow Pascal's advice.
Yeah.
Going in the other direction, maybe there's no right thing. Think of a moral dilemma, like Sophie's choice. There's no right thing to do. Or Sartre's case of the student who's torn between fighting in the war or staying home with his mother. Yeah. What's the right thing to do in this moral dilemma? It's not clear that there is one.
Or at least if you start saying that there is one thing, then you're making a claim maybe without even realizing that you're making a claim.
Yeah.
You've slipped in an assumption by using the...
That's right, yeah.
Any other examples of that one? Of the, or like people just assuming that there's one answer?
Yeah. Maximizing expected utility. We'll probably talk about expected utility later on, and there is, so here we're being told do the thing that maximizes expected utility. If you hear it that way, then there are problems on each side. There could be ties for expected utility, or there could be nothing that maximizes it. Things just get better and better without end.
Yeah, slightly, I guess it's not the same, but it reminds me of this saying that in philosophy you can have like two problems. One is to have like no answer to a question, and the other is to have like far too many explanations, and you can't tell which one's the right one.
That's right, and this corresponds to the two ways. And again, it's breaking down, so to speak, a harder problem into easier sub-problems. So you look on each side. Are there too many of these things, or are there not enough?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, what's another one?
Yeah. Philosophers love to talk about what's possible. They love to say X is possible.
Yeah, I guess a classic case of that is like the zombie thing, Chalmers'
Exactly.
zombies.
Yeah, that's right. Are zombies possible? Okay.
But that is like beings that would act like people but have no conscious experience.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And philosophers love to distinguish different senses of possibility: logical, metaphysical, gnomic, what's consistent with the laws of nature, doxastic, what's consistent with one's beliefs, epistemic, and so on, deontic. And there are various techniques for generating possibilities, or for arguing that something, call it X, is possible.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, there are two moving parts to that. There's X and is possible. So focus on X first. One kind of technique says, look at some other property of X, and it follows from X having this other property that X is possible. Let's just do a few of those.
Yeah.
X is actual.
Okay.
Suppose X is actual. So for a lot of the modalities I just talked about, the possibilities, that's a good way to establish that X is possible.
So if something exists, it must.
Yeah. Doesn't work for all of them, not the deontic, not the doxastic, but it works for the others mostly. X has positive probability, okay? And we could divide that into objective probability, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, or subjective probability, and maybe that corresponds to some objective possibility and some subjective, maybe doxastic possibility.
Yeah.
Okay, so far we're staring at X. Well, you gave a good one. X is conceivable. That's Dave Chalmers appeals to that one in the zombie argument.
Yeah.
X is conceivable, so it's possible.
That it's like it's possible to imagine it, and therefore you like start reasoning from that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. What are some examples of cases where philosophers make this argument? I guess we've got the zombie one, but it seems like it's maybe a slightly dubious style of argument where you're saying, well, something can be imagined, therefore, like I'm going to conclude things from that.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, philosophers love thought experiments. And I guess soon we'll be talking about some pretty recherche thought experiments. And even if these things aren't actual, like the St. Petersburg game or something, still we might say, look, we can conceive of this. In that sense, it's possible, and we should take it seriously and test our theories against it. That was, by the way, just one way to show that X is possible.
Okay, yeah.
And remember, there's the other moving part. X is possible. How about we look at some other object, let's call it Y, some other thing, and Y is possible. We could all agree on that. And X is appropriately related to Y, and we conclude that X must be possible too.
So you're related in what way?
So here are some ways. If Y is possible and Y entails X, then it seems pretty safe that X is possible too.
Yeah.
If they're compatible, then it seems that X is possible too. Here's one of my favorite ones. Almost X is possible. So let Y be almost X. It's very similar to X in some appropriate sense.
Yeah.
And then you say, well, the small difference between Y, which is almost X, and X won't make a difference to possibility. An example of that, according to behaviorism, it's not possible to have a mental life and no behavioral manifestation of it whatsoever. Reply, yes, it is possible, because it's possible to have almost no behavioral manifestation of your mental life. Think of Stephen Hawking, sadly no longer with us, and towards the end, I guess he had just very minimal behavior, movement of his finger, not much more. Obviously, he had a rich mental life.
Yeah.
And now imagine just that finger movement stopping, so he loses that last bit of behavior.
Yeah.
It's not like the lights suddenly go out for Stephen Hawking. So it is possible.
This is reminding me of another line of argument that some people might have heard, which is, some people say, oh, you couldn't create a mechanical mind, or you couldn't create a mind out of machines. And you say, well, let's take a human brain and let's just replace one neuron with a mechanism that does just what that neuron does. It'll be like, are you not a person now? Are you not conscious? And it'll be like, no, really. So they're like, what if we place another one? And then the person is either just forced to say, like, you're becoming like gradually less conscious, or to concede, or that there's some sharp cutoff, which also seems implausible.
Excellent. So this is another of the heuristics of this kind. Let's call it extrapolation. So you have a sequence of things and you think that each of them is possible. Well, now let's just go to the next step. That should be possible too.
Yeah.
Or interpolation. Start with two things that you know are possible, maybe because they're actual, and now interpolate on some whatever gradable scale. Hume's missing shade of blue is like this.
Okay, yeah.
Take two shades of blue that are actual, therefore possible, and now imagine a missing shade of blue. It's not actual, but it's somehow between those two on some natural scale.
Yeah.
Well, that seems to be possible too.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, couldn't someone respond that it's not possible, that actually they're too close, there's no shade in between? Well.
They could say that, and you've got to be careful with your scales too, and sometimes extrapolating or interpolating will give you wrong answers. Like, think of the function, the sequence 1 over n, 1, half, third, quarter, etc.
Yeah.
Is it possible for that sequence to reach 0? Well, no. It gets as close as you like, so almost reaching 0 is possible, but it never actually hits 0. That's not possible for that sequence.
What's an example of the thing where you kind of repeat the thing, the sequence again and again and again? I guess that's an example where you're kind of extrapolating. Are there examples where you take some principle and then you just like keep operating it and then you get some absurd conclusion?
How about maybe the lottery paradox is
Okay,
like
yeah,
this? Is
yeah.
that what you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Let's try it. Or even better, maybe the preface paradox.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Yeah, let's do the
Hit us,
preface
yeah.
paradox. This puts pressure on the idea that belief is closed under conjunction.
Okay.
You've just written a long book, and then you write the following preface. I believe everything I say in this book, but I'm confident that there's a mistake somewhere in the book.
Yeah.
Okay. So I did my best to get sentence number 1 right. I believe sentence number 1. I believe sentence number 2. ... all the way to,
Yeah.
I believe the final sentence of the book. But I don't believe the conjunction of the book. On the contrary, I know that in long books like this, there's always a mistake somewhere. Okay, so this puts pressure on the idea that belief, even rational belief, is closed under conjunction.
Yeah. A different approach that sometimes I apply is like trying to subdivide things like super closely.
Yeah.
Every so often people say to me that you can't, it's not possible to put a probability on like things that have never happened before. So it's like fine to say that the probability of a coin flip being heads is 50%, but if you say something like the probability of a nuclear war in 2027 is like 1.5%, then this is just a bunch of silliness, and like because it's never happened before. But then of course you can say, well, if you define all events like sufficiently closely, then none of them have ever happened before. Like all events are unprecedented once you like specify exactly what they are.
That's right. If you specify the events too precisely, then they're all unique. If you specify them too loosely, then of course anything can be described as something happens.
Yeah.
Okay, we have many instances of that, all right? And now you want to find the right level of grain that describes this event in an informative way and such that's susceptible, let's hope, to some probability.
Now that I think about it, I mean, that potentially creates trouble for the like coin being 50%, because you say, well, like each coin flip is unique in its own way, and like exactly like whether in any specific case, like it depends on how they flipped it. And so if you define, and if you like specify that, then it's 100% and 0%.
Yeah, maybe we'll soon be talking about frequentism, but this is related to a famous problem for the frequentist account of probability, the problem of the single case.
Right.
At some level of specification, every event only happens once, and then at some events, that is quite a natural thing to do. Like this year's AFL Grand Final, that's Australian rules football for the non-Australians. Okay, that seems to be a unique event, and there may be an issue about how we assign probabilities to it, but it seems as far as frequencies go, it's a one-off thing. It's either 1 or 0 for, say, Collingwood, my team, winning.
Yeah, yeah. All right, yeah, are there any other heuristics that people should keep in mind if they want to kind of outwit their friends in conversation before we move on?
Yeah. Oh, I like to think about putting contrastive stress on different words in a claim, and that makes you realize there's a contrast class, this as opposed to that. Let's take, for example, smoking a pack a day causes lung cancer. That seems reasonable when you just say it like that. Well, smoking as opposed to other things you could do with a cigarette, like stroking it.
Okay.
Yes, it seems like the smoking is relevant.
Yeah.
Smoking a pack a day, smoking 1 pack a day. Now, as opposed to none, yes, that seems to cause lung cancer. But what about smoking 1 pack a day as opposed to 3 packs a day? Now it's not so clear that it's the 1 pack a day that causes the lung cancer as opposed to 3. And this now makes you think that explanation must be a contrastive matter.
Yeah, I see.
This
saying
as
like people
opposed
could
to
slip in counterfactuals or like an alternative. They're saying 1 as opposed to 0, but we don't say that most of the time, and so you could accidentally end up having a counterfactual that you haven't really like properly thought through. Yeah,
and yes, this makes you be honest. What am I contrasting this thing with? Maybe that was implicit and not obvious. And this technique where I mentally italicize different words in a claim and say, okay, in each case, this as opposed to what? And then I realize, oh, okay, I was making a presupposition or something like that.
Yeah. Okay, so I suppose like all of these heuristics can potentially provide kind of stress cases or like, I guess, considerations against conclusions that people are putting forward.
Yeah.
In general, do you think that there's very often like decisive arguments against a position, or is it more often that just all of these like weaknesses kind of accumulate and then you end up with kind of a view that like there's too many problems here for this to be quite the right theory?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking like most theories you can throw something at them and be like, it doesn't feel quite right in this case.
Yeah. Lewis famously said, philosophical positions are rarely refuted. Gettier may have done it. That's the justified true belief analysis of knowledge. Gödel might have done it, but it's
about it.
It's rare. I think there are some killer problems for various positions. We might talk about some later.
Yeah.
But yes, often it's more a matter of accumulation. You know, there are some smaller problems, but they start adding up, and overall, the position doesn't seem tenable. It doesn't seem to best capture the data points.
Yeah, do people sometimes give up on them because it feels like, okay, you could like patch the first 3 things kind of, but then just like more and more cracks start appearing and you're like trying to patch it up everywhere and you're like, it starts to feel like more complicated to patch it than to epicycles, right? Yeah, it feels like more complicated to patch the theory than just to come up with a new one.
That's right. Some might say that happened to the justified true belief account of knowledge, that can't be quite right, it seems, because of Gettier and so on. Then we add an epicycle and another one and another one.
Yeah.
And if it goes too far, it starts to feel like a degenerating research program.
Maybe it's like, the explanation is now so long that it's lost its original intuitive appeal. It's no longer simple either.
That's right. And even if it turned out, all right, I can't come up with any counterexamples to this tremendously long, complicated analysis, but do I really feel it illuminated? Suppose that really is, knowledge is this thing with many epicycles.
Yeah.
Do I feel like I understand it better?
Yeah.
Not really.
Okay, well, what are some common moves that philosophers make trying to debunk other philosophers' ideas that you think are kind of overrated? It's like not as strong an objection as people make out.
Well, something that a whole movement in philosophy that I now distance myself from. I think this speaks to your question. Philosophers love to appeal to other worlds, and in particular, similar worlds. This may come up when we talk about counterfactuals, that the standard analysis of counterfactuals appeals to most similar possible worlds, but not just counterfactuals. Knowledge, we often talk about so-called safety and sensitivity, and that's a matter of what's going on in nearby worlds where you believe something or where the thing you believe is true or not true. And I used to just talk this way too. I used to love all this talk of similar worlds and other worlds in general. And now I've jumped off the bus, and I think one should not be casting everything in terms of other worlds and similarity relations. I prefer to do it in terms of probability and stay in the actual world. Probabilities anchored here, and it will give my preferred accounts of things. That doesn't quite speak to your question, but I think it's close.
Okay, yeah. Any other advice for budding young philosophers in the audience before we push on to concrete questions?
Budding advice. The highest value for me in philosophy is clarity. I really care about clarity. And by the way, these heuristics, I think, help in that mission as well, trying to just really get clear on what a position is and what its possible defects are. And if you, as I think Searle said, if you can't say it clearly, you don't really understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I would begin with that.
Yes, I'm not sure I 100% agree with that. So philosophers do tend to just be absolutely obsessed with like making sure that their thing applies to every case. And when you read philosophy papers, you really do get this impression that it's like a long series of like paragraphs added to like consider like every objection that some philosopher might raise. So there's like nothing that can be said in response. I suppose in like one sense that's extremely clear. In another sense, it feels like maybe you're like losing the forest for the trees sometimes.
Yeah.
Like in considering often like clever small objections rather than like is the core part of the thesis sound.
Yeah, maybe being too pedantic.
Yeah.
Come on, you know roughly what I meant. But
yeah, it seems to some degree like philosophers are kind of professional pedants. That's kind of their whole thing is to find the edge cases.
That's right. And I'm sure you know the way that philosophers often write. It's often in this very defensive style because you're preparing yourself for the most uncharitable objection because you didn't quite nail the point. Given your wording, there's some counterexample. And this should be tempered with the principle of charity, that you should try to give a charitable interpretation of what's being said and look for more interesting, more profound, deeper objections.
It is the most challenging part of, I think, interviewing philosophers is that they really want to be right. And it's like, can you, for the love of God, say something wrong? Like, say something wrong, but less words, please.
Right. And you ask a question and, well, that's not quite right the way you said it. But if at least the spirit of it's conveyed, that is often good enough.
I suppose, if you get too sloppy in that direction, then you can't like do philosophy so much anymore. Then you just become like ordinary people who accept common sense and like are not looking for like the little ways that like end up like when you like investigate more deeply, it does actually demolish common sense when you think about it properly. Okay, let's push on to a topic that is dear to all of our hearts, probability. The core question I really want to ask here is whether Bayesianism, as it's often practiced by people in the audience, whether it's true in some sense. But before I ask that, we should probably wind back a step. At a high level, what are the different theories of what probability is? Like what ideas do people have about it?
This is what my professor should have said when I asked the question, "What is P?" and he thought I needed medication. This would be the beginning of a reply. Let's distinguish three main kinds of probability. The first, let's call it objective chance. Out there in the world, there's probability, and it's mind independent. It doesn't care what we think. So think maybe of radioactive decay. The radium atom has a decay law. It's got a half-life of 1,600 years, which is a probabilistic fact. It doesn't care what anyone thinks. It's just out there in the world. It's like mass and charge. It's some property out there. That's the first.
Makes sense.
Right, second one, let's call it...
I guess under that one, do we have kind of quantum mechanics issues? It's like the probability of an electron being here rather than there. Is that in the same category?
And that's a big question in the interpretation of quantum mechanics, whether there really are objective probabilities or is, in fact, everything deterministic and really the chances are all ones and zeros on one view.
Wow.
But
But let's skip that.
That's a debate to be had. Okay, second interpretation, let's call it subjective probability. And that's now more about rational agents, people like us. Call it credence, if you like. And it's degree of confidence. Sometimes we outright believe things, but it's often our degrees of confidence are more nuanced than that. We believe some things more than others, as we might say. We have degrees of belief.
Yeah.
And that would be the second interpretation. But here, not just anything goes. It seems these are rational degrees of belief, and it'll turn out, according to Bayesianism, they're constrained by probability theory.
So would there be the correct credence?
Excellent. This will get us to a big issue in Bayesianism. At one extreme, you've got, I guess, a very permissive, radical subjectivism, where the only constraint is obey the probability calculus. Thou shalt obey Kolmogorov's axioms, something like that.
So it's like everything's got to sum to 1, or the probability of something happening is 1.
That's right. Probabilities are non-negative.
Yeah.
They have a top value of 1. They add in a certain way.
Yeah.
Okay. Now that seems very permissive. You know, I can assign probability even 1 to, a meteor, quantum tunneling through this lecture theatre before we're finished and going out the other side.
Yeah.
As long as I give probability 0 to it not doing
else.
so and so on. And very high probability to the sun not rising tomorrow and so on. And
it doesn't violate any fundamental axioms of probability.
That's right, yeah. But it seems somehow too unconstrained.
Right.
Okay. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, this is the so-called uniqueness thesis, that your evidence uniquely constrains you, and there's exactly one credence you should have. And in fact, there was, let's call it an prior. There was the
correct thing to think before you saw anything at all.
Prior probability before any evidence. You should start there and just update it on your evidence as it comes in. Now, that seems too extreme, perhaps in the other direction, that given my evidence, there's a sharp probability I should give to it raining tomorrow. And
if I said 71.2 rather than 71.1, I was wrong to think that.
Yes, that's right. And you'd think that different people could disagree to some extent, but not according to this thesis, not if they're rational. And then you've got all the positions in between in this spectrum, and we could then have discussions about just how much credences are constrained. Actually, this nicely brings us to the third main interpretation. Let's call it evidential probability.
Yeah.
And the thought is that evidence does put some constraints on hypotheses or propositions, degrees of support, let's call them, okay? And probabilities measure these degrees of support. So, for example, maybe given your evidence, it's very probable that the sun will rise tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then we might say the evidential probability of sunrise given your evidence is high.
So I haven't quite tracked that. Yeah, how is this different than the previous ones?
Yeah. So the previous one, we started with just subjective probability.
Yeah.
And notice how we sort of morphed into the third one. But first we said we had the permissive radical subjectivism that said anything. It's up to you.
Yeah.
Your choice.
You believe whatever you like.
Yeah, your credence, just run with it and then update it appropriately. And that definitely was not evidential probability. And then probably when we get to the other extreme, the uniqueness thesis, then it does seem that that would be something very much like evidential probability that would constrain you. And then there are the positions in between. So I don't want to make a sharp division between subjective and evidential probability. Really, it's a spectrum. And this corresponds to what you might call subjective Bayesianism or more objective Bayesianism and degrees of that as we move down the spectrum.
Yeah, okay, so there's a spectrum between like the subjective Bayesianism and these kind of evidential Bayesianism. So like where you can believe anything and where you have to believe like one specific thing. And like both of them feel they feel pretty terrible in their own way. And you're saying like maybe the most plausible thing or the most intuitive thing is going to be somewhere in the middle where it's like there's a range of stuff that you can believe that's not stupid.
Yes.
but you can like go too far, and it's also not just like one specific thing. You're not like an idiot if you don't believe the exact truth.
Yeah.
I guess whenever you have a spectrum like that, it's going to feel a little bit arbitrary, whatever point you draw on there. So like, how would we even begin to know like what is the correct point along that spectrum?
Yeah. Well, we start adding some constraints to the radical subjectivism. Maybe, for example, the principle of indifference.
Yeah.
You might think that's a kind of evidential probability. Okay?
Explain that?
Yeah. Okay, when your evidence bears symmetrically on a range of possibilities, not favouring any over any other, then you should give equal probability to these cases.
Yeah.
It's most plausible in gambling cases, like you toss a coin, heads, tails. My evidence doesn't favour heads over tails. It seems I should give half-half to those possibilities. And then we can complicate that and fine-grain some problem and then say, well, either you have no evidence, so you should give equal probability to the cases, or you do have evidence but it bears symmetrically on them and you should give equal probabilities. Now, the big discussion could be had. There are meant to be various serious problems. There are serious problems with the principle of indifference as I just stated it. And various people think it's bankrupt because of these problems.
Yeah.
But it's funny how people often reach for it intuitively, even when they've disavowed it a minute ago. For example, in the Monty Hall problem, maybe you know that.
Yeah.
That, you know, behind one of 3 doors, there's some prize. What probability should you give to it being behind a particular door? And then the problem continues. Now, no one says, oh, I give probability 1/17 to the prize being behind door number 1 because I'm just unconstrained and that's what I feel like. So, 1/17. You feel the pull of the principle of indifference. I should give third,
Yeah.
even if you've just a moment ago disavowed the principle of indifference. So it seems like in some restricted cases, at least, it has some pull.
Well, I suppose we've been talking here about like what you should believe, which I suppose is like smuggling in this idea that there is like anything that you should believe. We've like practically brought in like ethics before, or like sort of ethical considerations almost into what you should believe. Maybe that would be too much to get into here. This
Ethics,
like why?
We may be getting into ethics later too, and which is not my area of specialisation, but I'm always happy to try.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that kind of scene setting about like what probability might be out of the way, the real question I want to ask you, me and my friends, when we're like hanging out, when we're chatting, we're watching the news or talking about events in the world, I might say something like, I think there's like an 80% chance that Boris Johnson is going to resign in the next week or two, and someone else might say, no, I think it's 70%, and then we like go and check the news, and like more ministers have resigned, and we're like, okay, I think it's like 85% now.
100%
are we doing that
now?
Right, 100% now, yeah, okay. But are we doing the right thing? Is this like the correct thing to do, or are we just like playing some game that's like fun for us and is like not really any better than any other approach, or at least like not like uniquely privileged as the correct approach?
Yeah, so I am a big fan of Bayesianism. I guess I say on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, I call myself a Bayesian. Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, I'm not so sure. Today's Saturday,
right? It is Saturday, yeah. Okay,
so maybe I'm not so sure. But I think there's something right about this. We have these degrees of confidence. I think we have to allow this. It's not just all or nothing belief.
Yeah.
It does seem there are better and worse ways to manage these degrees of confidence. There are various good reasons to think that they should obey probability theory. We may talk about that, Dutch books, for example. There are ways that they should update, so-called conditionalization. And we can then have disputes about how much constraint there should be on the priors that you have.
Yeah.
And we had a bit of that discussion before.
Yeah.
But it seems like a very good model, and it's very fertile too. Lots of good things are closely related to this. Maybe soon we'll talk about decision theory, another thing that I'm fond of, and probabilities figure centrally in that. And so I think it's a good place to start.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Go to follow-ups. Okay. So yeah, one is like, what are the live alternatives, and then maybe I'm kind of curious to know like what other what are, like why are you 4 days out of the week? Well, I can't remember if it was 3 or 4, but some of the week you're not into Bayesianism or not into like this approach. Okay. Let's do that one first. Like what are the reservations that you have?
Yeah. We start with some axiomatization of probability, and Kolmogorov is the standard, okay? And he axiomatized unconditional probability first, and then conditional probabilities defined in terms of unconditional probabilities. The probability of A given B is a ratio, probability of A and B divided by the probability of B, assuming that the probability of B is positive. I actually think it should be the other way around. I think that conditional probability is the basic notion, the fundamental notion. I think there are problems with Kolmogorov's axiomatization. As I've just put it, he did have further subtleties, which I can't get into here. But two kinds of problem. Remember, I had this proviso, provided that the bottom line of that ratio is positive. You can't divide by zero. But here's now another problematic feature of the standard theory with real valued probabilities. It seems that probability zero events can happen. Now, that's not intuitive. We normally think if something can happen, it must have positive probability.
What's an example?
Okay, think, for example, of the radium atom decaying exactly at noon tomorrow, say. What's the probability of that on the standard theory, where it's real valued probabilities, in this case, an exponential decay law? The probability of it decaying exactly at noon is zero. Now, it decaying in some infinitesimal region around noon, that could be something more, but zero itself, that point, gets probability zero. Or throw a dart at a dartboard. What's the probability that it hits randomly? It hits the exact center point. Okay.
So for people who didn't do much math at university, this is this classic thing that I guess if you're like, so imagine that we're going to randomly choose a real number, or let's say any number between 0 and 1. The probability of being any specific one of them, any specific number is 0 because there's like uncountably infinitely many numbers. Indeed, I think the probability of you picking, randomly picking a number that could ever even be written down is 0, right?
Well, you think it computable?
It's not computable, right?
And there are uncountably many of those. And,
Okay. So you're saying each of these like specific numbers has a probability of being chosen of 0, or any specific example that you pick is 0, and yet we know that one of them will be chosen. Okay. So it's a bit like the lottery paradox.
It is. It's like an uncountable lottery paradox, and this is a puzzling feature. And there is this rather strong intuition. Come on, if it can happen, it should get some positive probability. We want to distinguish it from an impossible event, and it seems the way to do that is, well, it's got greater probability. And actually, this is another way in which we might go away from this numerical Kolmogorov axiomatization. You might say more fundamental is comparative probability. And now the primitive is something like X is more probable than Y, or maybe better still, W given X is more probable than Y given Z, or at least as probable, and now make that the fundamental notion, and then we can maybe recover the numerical theory out of certain axioms and so on those fundamental comparative probabilities.
I'm just thinking about the like choosing a specific number case. Okay, so it's actually quite a bad situation, because you're saying normally with Bayesianism we're thinking we got a prior probability that any number be chosen, and then we update a lot based on the evidence. But of course our prior on any number is going to be 0, and when you like multiply anything by 0, it's still 0. So you should so a random number gets chosen. You have your prior, you observe the outcome, and you still think it wasn't chosen because it was impossible for any number to be chosen, whatever it was.
Well,
it's like quite bad.
Impossible in this probabilistic sense,
right?
And that's the trouble, that it seems that probability, so to speak, has a blurry vision. It does not distinguish between the genuine impossibilities and these very unlikely, but in some good sense possible cases. And this is related to my worry about the ratio formula. Again, you can't divide by 0. Now, what happens if you learn in this experiment where you randomly choose a real number from, say, 0, 1? You learn its value, but it's something you antecedently gave probability 0. If you just looked at the ratio as standardly understood, as involving a ratio of real numbers, it was 0 divided by 0, it is 0 that you'd get that particular number. Now, how do you update on that? How do you, as we say, conditionalize on something you originally gave probability 0? Now, I have to say that this quickly gets us into very sophisticated mathematical refinements. Kolmogorov himself was well aware of this problem, and he had a sophistication. People bring on hyperreal numbers, they bring on richer number systems that are meant to preserve this intuition that if something's possible, it had better have positive probability.
Yeah.
And we can let that debate unfold. But it's just to say, and now this is Saturday, and I'm saying, I'm just trying to bring out there are various problems with just this simple
It's
statement
not as straightforward as it seems.
Just follow Kolmogorov. Probabilism says your probabilities should obey these axioms. Well, it's more complicated.
Yeah.
Should we take conditional probability as primitive? Do we have to worry about the probability zeros? Do we enrich the number system beyond the reals? Should we take comparative probabilities as basic? Lots of debates to be had.
Yeah, this might be a stupid, frivolous question, but is it I guess not possible. Is it possible to have a probability that's below, like a negative probability, or like a probability above 1, or like, well, I'm just thinking, obviously we have imaginary numbers now, like off the real number line.
Yes.
Is any of this coherent?
Yeah, well, some people think so. Feynman thought there could be negative probabilities. And of course, you're not obeying Kolmogorov, the Kolmogorov axiomatization. Thou shalt have non-negative probabilities. There are some thoughts along these lines that there's something that behaves probability-like, some function that seems to have probabilistic properties, and then you see that it sometimes goes negative. There are meant to be some physical examples of this. And then you say, well, those are the negative probabilities. There are some problems with this. Just to take one, consider the usual formula for independence. Two events A and B are independent, just in case the probability of A and B equals the probability of A times the probability of B. Now suppose you have independent negative probability events. Their product, something negative times something negative, is positive.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
And that seems to be a problem if you think the event itself and maybe the conjunction of it with something else has negative probability. How does independence pan out?
Yeah.
Huge, issue we could get into there too.
Yeah. We've only got 5 minutes left on stage, so I wanted to give you a chance to offer the audience a few criticisms of frequentism, which is, so firstly, like, what is frequentism? And secondly, like, what are some of the problems that we haven't yet mentioned with it? Okay.
Frequentism, remember my taxonomy of objective probability, subjective probability, evidential probability. Frequentism would be a version of objective probability. Out there in the world, mind independent, there are these probabilities. What are they? They're relative frequencies. So take a simple case. What's the objective probability that the coin lands heads? Let's suppose it's a fair coin.
Yeah.
Well, you toss the coin a number of times and see how it lands and count the number of heads over the grand total. If that number turns out to be a half, then bingo, you've got a chance of a half for heads.
Yeah.
And now we generalize that. So in general, the probability of some, let's call it an attribute relative to some reference class, so attribute A relative to reference class R, is the relative frequency of A's in that reference class.
Makes sense, I think.
And I think it may be still the most popular account among scientists.
Yeah, it's always scientists, isn't it? They're the ones.
They need to talk to philosophers.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on so many things. But sorry. Okay, so this is kind of this has an intuitive appeal, and it's a bit like how you're taught about probability at high school or something like that.
Yes, that's right. And we all know that there's got to be some close connection between probability and frequency, and frequentism posits the tightest connection of all, identity. And now we could distinguish two kinds of frequentism. You might call it actual frequentism. You just look at what actually happens. You just, in fact, toss the coin some number of times, count the number of heads, divide by the total of trials, you're done. And then we could go hypothetical and say, well, no, I really meant some long run of heads. Maybe I didn't get a long run, so I go hypothetical. I imagine counterfactually a long run of heads, and it's the relative frequency I would get maybe in the limit if I have infinitely many trials. We have two versions. And you probably want to ask why I don't like frequentism. I think any version of frequentism has the following kind of problem. I think it's just built into the very notion of probability that fixing the probability of something is compatible with just any pattern and any frequency of the corresponding outcomes.
I see.
Let's
Explain,
do it, let's do it for the coin toss. Let's suppose we have a fair coin, by which I mean the chance of heads is a half. I say that's compatible with any distribution of heads and tails, including heads on every toss, tails on every toss, and everything in between. And I can even tell you what the probabilities of those outcomes are. It's 1 on 2 to the n for n trials for each exact sequence. But it seems you can't say that if you're a frequentist, because if the coin lands heads every time, then that's probability 1 according to frequentism. So there are various problems. We talked about the problem of the single case earlier. There's the problem of the double case. If I toss a coin twice, then I can only have probabilities of 0, half, and 1. Offhand, I would have thought there could be other biases. And as I like to point out, it turns out that you cannot toss a fair coin an odd number of times according to frequentism, at least this actual frequentism, because just by definition, according to them, if it's an odd number of times, you can't have exactly a ratio of half of heads. That just doesn't seem...
It seems pretty weird.
That seems pretty weird. You'll also have, I guess, a version of the gambler's fallacy. Suppose you somehow know that the chance of heads is a half of this coin, and you start tossing the coin, and you see a surprisingly long run of heads, as could happen. But if you know that somehow God tells you that the chance of heads is a half, you know that tails must be coming because they've got to make up for the run of heads that's happened so far. Okay, that was actual frequentism. Now let's go to the other kind, the hypothetical frequentism.
It'll have to be fairly quick.
It will be super quick. But now we have some counterfactual. This is not what actually happens. If you were to toss the coin some large number of times, maybe infinitely many times, this is what would happen. I think, well, for a start, this is a very weird counterfactual. Imagine tossing an actual coin, like the 20-cent coin in my pocket, infinitely many times. What would that even mean? That this coin would disintegrate before then. So we'd have to violate the laws of nature so that it would survive infinitely long. I think it's very strange to think there's a fact of the matter of exactly how the coin would land in this infinite sequence, and even what its frequencies would be.
So you're trying to make this like very practical theory, or that's its kind of its virtue, but then it seems to involve this bizarre scenario that could never happen to back it up.
Exactly. And I'll give actual frequentism credit. At least it was, I suppose, practical, anchored in the world, gave you numbers that you could ascertain. Now, when the problems start piling up, and I gave you a few of them, you start retreating to this other version, the hypothetical frequentism, but this seems to have other problems. It's not practical, it's not ascertainable, I can't make sense of these counterfactuals, they seem to be about the wrong thing, about some idealized coin that would never disintegrate, and what have you. And so put it all together, and I think frequentism
it's looking pretty bad.
Is looking pretty bad. I know there are lots of frequentists out there. Read my papers, the 15 arguments against finite frequentism, 15 arguments against hypothetical frequentism, and I think it's in a bit of trouble. All
right, well, we have to go upstairs because other people need the stage here. But we're going to go chat about ways of breaking expected value, counterfactuals, and why and your many objections to objective utilitarianism.
Cool.
But for now, can everyone give a round of applause to Alan?
Thanks very much.